Hey, everybody. Hope you're doing well. Great to see everyone. My name is Abhijeet, and I'm a software engineer at Sentry. And as mentioned before, I work on Sentry's open source SDKs, helping developers instrument their applications and grab data to help find errors. And what we're going to be talking about today, performance issues. Now, one thing we've kind of noticed working on performance monitoring at Sentry is that it can be really hard, especially when you're building front-end applications with frameworks like Vue, to even know, where do I get started? How do I even know if something is a problem? And so hopefully this talk helps give kind of a nice introduction into the variety of topics that come with performance and helps give you a different view into web performance. And so in order to start talking about this kind of stuff, let's cover the agenda. So first, we're going to take a look at, okay, how do I kind of identify the performance problems that may come up in the websites and web applications that I've built? This includes looking at things like operations and influencing factors that come with the site that you built. Afterwards, when we've kind of laid that foundation of, okay, I kind of can see where the problem is coming from, we can start measuring it to actually see how it impacts you and your users. And then at the end, as a slight sneak peek, I want to kind of show off how we think about these things at Sentry in terms of performance monitoring and helping people solve the performance issues of the websites they build. So let's start off. How can we kind of identify performance problems? Well, first of all, let's kind of think and take a step back. I just built a great app using Vue, maybe Nuxt. I've deployed it. In order to think about performance, we have to think about how people are using it. And that comes into what are the operations that we care about. The first one is probably the one you're most familiar with. It's rendering a page. I navigate to a URL, it pings the server, it grabs some HTML and some other assets, and it renders it onto the screen. That's a really fundamental operation that's really important to users. In fact, that's probably what people care most about when they think of how performant, how fast, how usable a website is. And so a page load is a hard refresh where they get all of the assets. And if you're using, you're probably building single page applications with Vue, you probably have client-side routing with something like Vue Router. So you don't do a full page refresh, you do kind of navigations. And that's still, we're rendering new components onto a page, still important to care about. The second side of things, probably not as visible, but still as important, is this idea of user interactions. Key downs, mouse downs, scrolls, all of these things as the user is using your application, you want them to be performant, to be usable, to be flexible. So it's important to keep and think about. Aside from the operations, though, when someone interacts with your site and does these two things, there are a lot of factors aside from just the code you write that potentially affects the performance of your web applications. I've collected a couple of them here. There are probably way more that you can probably think of. But it's really amazing to think that a lot of these things are actually outside of your control, right? You write some application, you deploy it, people are navigating to your site, but things like the browser they use, the network conditions that it's under, the underlying hardware, if it's like mobile or a laptop device, the conditions of your cache, if you have like a CDN setup or any kind of caching strategy, even the user type, right? Like if you have different kinds of roles in your app you build or site you build, like an admin versus a regular user, they might have completely different experiences, and so therefore completely different performance characteristics. And so it's important to keep that in mind. Essentially, this means that performance data is high cardinality. There's a ton of additional factors that come with thinking about how performant the websites you build are. Lastly, aside from operations and inputs, it's important to think that performance is really about people. It's like practicing empathy. Everything that is like kind of driven on a site, you load a page, you click a button, this is all user driven. And so fundamentally, all front-end operations are user-based. This means that how a user is using and thinking about your application and perceiving your application actually affects what they think about in terms of performance. And so things like response time, people probably can't really tell the difference between 1 or 2 seconds, but they can definitely tell, something takes 10 seconds to load versus 1, for example. And so hopefully now we know performance is all about people. We have these operations we care about. We have all of these different factors. I think that gives us a foundation to actually start going into our applications and grabbing data and measuring stuff. So let's talk about that. How do we start getting the data? How do we start measuring stuff? So quantitative data is probably the best. If you have some hard numbers, it's probably the easiest for you to start thinking about and start making changes to. But it's fine to start if it's also qualitative. The really important part about collecting data here, it gives you an indication of the problem and the potential impact, and also allows you to compare. So, for example, if you start tracking how long it takes for a page to load, you can now start comparing page loads across different kinds of pages, maybe across different kinds of users, maybe across different kinds of browsers. And this also allows you to kind of understand the impact of different solutions that you can roll out. Let's say you improve how you bundle assets, or you do code splitting. You can check that if it works across all of your different user types. Once you also have this data down, you can also guard against potential regressions. You can say, okay, I have this metric. I've improved my page load. I've improved how long it takes for this mouse down to work. I want to make sure it doesn't happen again. I want to guard against regressions. And again, the cardinality really matters here. So attaching your data with a bunch of different attributes, what kind of browser it was coming from, if your API requests that was used to load the page were cached or not, really important, really helps put everything into perspective. Okay, so what kind of stuff can we measure? The first one, probably easiest, is if you have a site, means that you have to go and grab stuff from the server, grab it over the wire. Stuff like your HTML, CSS, images, all of that. And so measuring asset size is a great first step into thinking about performance problems. JavaScript, probably pretty easy. You can measure your bundle size. There's a ton of great tools to do it. You can also do the same for your CSS and for kind of your other kind of assets as well, images, videos, and audios. Check if it's optimized. Check if you really do need to load that on the page at all. And check what other kind of data you're sending over the wire. You might be surprised, you're sending fonts that never get used, or JSON blobs that just inevitably aren't used for some reason. And so this is a great way to kind of get an idea and to challenge your assumptions on specifically looking at how long it takes to load a page. Okay, so that's the stuff coming from over the wire. That's measuring your asset size. Now let's actually think about, I have content on a page. How do my users feel about it? Is it loading quickly? Is it loading predictably? And to do that, some really smart folks from all over came together to design what they call web vitals. And these are a set of metrics that are used to kind of say, how is my website or web application performing? And so you don't have to go and kind of make up your own metrics. You can kind of use these industry standards. In the first one, we have first paint, or first contentful paint, which is just the time it takes for the first content to render. This should be super fast, basically just dependent on the network conditions of actually loading stuff from the server. If you have a really high first contentful paint, it means that there's something wrong, because it means that a user is probably just staring at a blank page. You should fix that. Second up is, in terms of the vitals, is a cumulative layout shift, which is kind of, to kind of give an example, you probably had this happen before. You load a page, elements render, you might see a button and you're like, oh, I want to click that button. You go to click the button, but suddenly the button shifts down because an element or HTML element above got inserted. And so these kind of layout shifts of elements moving around is really confusing and unperformant. And so CLS is kind of score of how visually stable the website you build is. Next, we have LCP, which is probably the metric that most people pay attention to in terms of all of these web vitals. It's the largest contentful paint. It measures kind of the render time for the largest content to appear in the viewport. This is really important because it's kind of a heuristic on how long does it take for the main content on the page to show up? And this kind of helps understand visual completeness, because a user doesn't necessarily have to see the entire page to see, like, be happy with it or to be able to use it. They just need to see the most important elements or the elements that they care about. LCP is a heuristic, though, so there are some challenges to that we'll speak to afterwards. Finally, these kind of first three concerned ourselves with the rendering operation, loading a page. And this last one is FID, first input delay, which concerns ourselves with user interactions. And so basically measures if users are able to successfully interact with the page and what the delay to that is. And so how do we kind of measure these web vitals? Well, there's two ways we can measure them: in the field or in the lab. So in the lab, there are a ton of great tools out there, things like Chrome Lighthouse. I just ran this performance report maybe like 30 minutes ago on the Vue 3 docs, which are some really great docs, but not the best performance score, but what can you do? And you can kind of see this is like a simulated synthetic experiment. I ran this and got this information off. And we can see there's like the largest contentful paint and some other metrics. What I would kind of recommend, though, and the strategy that you probably want to take, is not just to run these simulated experiments, but to run stuff in the field. Include JavaScript libraries that can measure this for every single one of your users, so you can fully understand performance across all of your users, not just one-off experiments here and there. And so the Google team has a great library, Web Vitals. This is what Sentry's performance monitoring SDKs use under the hood. And you can just use these to grab data like LCP and FP from your pages and send them to wherever you want. There are other metrics also that are kind of important to think about, things like time to first byte or time to interactive. I won't go into them in too much detail here, but if you have questions about them, feel free to ask, and we can go into them afterwards. One thing to really note, though, is that there's this idea of blocking time and long spans and parse time. One of the biggest bottlenecks to having a fast render or fast page load is the fact that it takes time, especially in single page applications, to kind of parse through all your JavaScript and then to kind of execute all your initialization logic. And so that's things like, you might be instantiating a Vuex state, you might be grabbing stuff from local storage, making additional network calls to set up your layout. And all the time while you're kind of blocking that main thread, because JavaScript is single threaded, your kind of UI is stuck. And things might not be loading. And so that means your Vue components might not be loading. Other requests might not be happening, which basically it leads to unperformant application and a poor user experience. So if you have anything to kind of pay attention to here, I pay attention to the total blocking time, which unfortunately is kind of hard to grab in the field. Really can only do it in kind of lab settings like with Lighthouse. With your metrics, after you collected them, it's really important to note, though, that you can't just treat them as one-off numbers. Distributions really matter here. Here's an example from Sentry. This is the Sentry performance monitoring product. We can see that it's showing off some of the web vitals for a page load. And here we can see that averages don't really tell the whole story. It's important to use a histogram with various data points to kind of see the distribution, because that tells you across the board how your users are feeling and how all of your users kind of their kind of performance characteristics when using your site. This also allows you to kind of slice and dice your data, because you can kind of see a distribution for all users, then maybe check, okay, what if they're only using Firefox? Does the distribution change? It also allows you to kind of see outliers or different kinds of distributions. So if you have something like a bimodal distribution with 2 peaks, you know that there are two really common cases that users are falling into. And that's just interesting, and it tells you more than just necessarily relying on, okay, I know my average LCP is 2 seconds. Another thing here is to watch out for LCP. It's a heuristic. It might not always pick the element that's important. So here's an example. I'm showing you the Sentry front end, and it's actually what it does is it shows a big loading spinner before it loads the rest of the page. And the LCP that's chosen actually, because it is the largest element on the page right now, is the loading spinner, which is obviously not what we want. It's not the content we care about. We care about what comes after the loading spinner. And so LCP might not always choose the element that's important or what you care about or what your users care about. The nice thing, though, is that there are ways to kind of do custom timing and to gather metrics on stuff we do care about. There's the element timing API, but that's kind of doesn't have a ton of browser support, still kind of in beta. But the nice thing about using a UI framework like Vue is you have access to all of the Vue lifecycles. So you can time your components, see when they show up on a page, and say, okay, based on how my components rendered and in relation to various other things, I now know that my page is in a great state, it's really fast, or there's stuff that we need to work on, we need to improve. In order to kind of do that timing, the browser has a ton of great tools. There's a performance Sentry browser API. You can look this up. There's a ton of great docs and tutorials on how to use this. But this gives you kind of information both on resources and fetch and XHR calls, stuff that you can see in like your network tab, but also custom marks and measurements that you can use to just time whatever you'd like to time in your app. So a lot of things. There's web vitals, measuring your assets, using all these browser APIs, keeping track of your networks and your application types. I just want to kind of show you how we think about all this at Sentry. So if you install a Sentry SDK into your browser and into your web app that you build, we kind of collect all of this data out of the box. But all of this is available. You can use the Web Vitals libraries. You can use the individual browser APIs and do it yourself. So here's what it looks like at Sentry. This is like, you can see there's a page load operation. There's a bunch of logic being done to connect to the server. It's done by the browser. We then load some scripts and images. And we can see we have some kind of poor Web Vitals. 8 seconds to load the largest content isn't great, but it's probably because this is on a 3G connection, and maybe Edge, being the browser, has something to do with it as well. So as you can see, there's a lot more that goes into performance than just saying, okay, how long the page takes to load. It's a multifaceted problem, all about your users, all about how they're using your app. And hopefully this served as a great introduction to starting to look at your performance problems. So thank you very much. Really appreciate it. I just want to give a quick shout out to, if you're interested in using Sentry, into using our performance monitoring and setting it up, we have a course on Vue School for application monitoring with Sentry. Highly recommend, we'll check it out. You have a SDK for Vue and for performance monitoring. You can just use and set up and get all the stuff that I talked about out of the box. But yeah, thank you.